The relative numerical weakness of the attacking groups was due directly to the losses sustained in the air battles in the Solomons area. The fleet had not yet received its replacements. Approximately at 5 a.m., even as the first attack group prepared for takeoff, 2 enemy reconnaissance planes appeared suddenly from low clouds and dropped several small bombs on the Zuiho of the 1st Carrier Division. Captain Sueo Obayashi reported that a single bomb struck the rear of the flight deck, tearing a hole in the deck and curling the plates. He could not land any planes, but was able to launch his aircraft. 40 minutes after the first group was airborne, enemy planes attacked the 1st Carrier Division. The bombers appeared suddenly over the Shokaku after emerging from scattered clouds and went into glide-bombing attacks. The enemy formations appeared to consist of 15 to 16 planes. 5 or 6 medium-sized bombs scored direct hits on the carrier. The explosions tore great holes in the carrier deck and touched off fierce fires below decks. Excellent and rapid work by the crew extinguished the flames. Fortunately, the attack came after the Shokaku had launched her planes. Damage was confined to relatively small areas, but the ship could not launch or receive planes, and her communications were literally paralyzed. A single enemy plane attacked the Zuikaku, but a patrolling Zero fighter destroyed the bomber before it neared the ship. Far to the east of the Shokaku, the Zuikaku sought cover beneath scattered clouds and escaped further attacks. With his flagship crippled, Nagumo ordered Kakuda to take command of the Zuikaku and to continue the battle. The Shokaku left for northern waters and repairs. Prior to the raid on the 1st Carrier Division, Rear Admiral Hiroki Abe's advance force came under enemy attack. The force reported that an estimated 40 dive bombers and 10 torpedo bombers were attacking the battleships Hiei and Kirishima and the heavy cruisers Tone, Chikuma, and Suzuya. 10 dive bombers concentrated on the Tone, 30 dive bombers swarmed over the Chikuma, and the Suzuya received the assault of the 10 torpedo planes. The warships put up a withering anti-aircraft barrage, and by excellent evasive maneuvers avoided what might have been a disastrous blow. The ships received some damage, which was regarded as minor. Only the Chikuma, which bore the brunt of the attack, sustained heavy casualties to its officers and men, including Captain Kaizo Komura. The bombers scored 2 direct hits on the bridge and a direct hit in the torpedo tubes, but the cruiser was able to continue action. On their way to raid the enemy carrier, Lieutenant Commander Seki's first attack group from the 1st Carrier Division passed a force of about 20 enemy dive bombers headed for the Shokaku. Our escort fighter commander failed to recognize the planes as enemy aircraft and took no action. 10 minutes later, Seki's force encountered 8 enemy dive bombers protected by 6 fighters. The escort fighters from the Zuiho, led by Lieutenant Hidaka, ripped into the enemy formations and scattered the planes with heavy losses to the Americans. The wild scramble drained the fighters' fuel and ammunition, and the planes turned back, leaving Seki's force virtually unprotected. The interception enabled the Zuiho to escape bombing, but Seki's planes began their attack with only a few Zeros flying escorts. At 6:55 a.m., the bombers arrived over the enemy fleet. On the bridge of the Hunyo, I heard the radio conversations of our pilots. First, enemy aircraft carrier in sight. Then, a report that the American carrier was still some 250 nautical miles distant from the Shokaku. Shortly afterward, enemy's course is 300 degrees, speed 24 knots. A short wait, and all planes go in. At 7:10 a.m., Imajuku's torpedo bombers began their low-level assaults. The group sent back frequent radio reports with the important message that one Saratoga-class carrier is on fire. Subsequent investigation revealed that the enemy fleet was made up of 1 heavy cruiser, 1 light cruiser, 4 destroyers, and the carrier Hornet, the latter surrounded by the lighter ships. Our pilots reported they hit the Hornet with 5 550-pound bombs and 2 torpedoes, which crippled the great ship. I had special interest in this attack. Although I was delighted at the greatest success scored by our carrier planes since the Midway defeat, Seki was my old and good friend, and Imajuku a former student. I feared for the lives of both men. My apprehensions were well-founded, for their radio reports of their attacks were the last words they ever spoke. Their planes went down before the Hornets' defenses. We suffered additional severe losses. Lieutenant Shohei Yamada, the Shokaku's second squadron leader and the hero of many air battles after Pearl Harbor, was shot down. We received the full story from Lieutenant Kazuo Yakushiji, third squadron leader and the senior officer surviving the attack. Lieutenant Commander Seki's plane seemed to have taken several direct hits soon after he gave the order to attack. His craft was directly in front of mine as I went into my dive. I noticed the bomber enter the dive and suddenly begin to roll over on its back. Flames shot out of the bomber and, still inverted, it continued diving toward the enemy ship. Lieutenant Commander Murata of the 2nd Attack Group of the 1st Carrier Division was another former classmate. He specialized in torpedo attack procedures at the Yokosuka Air Corps and had become one of the world's foremost authorities on the subject. With his extensive background, exceptional flying skill, and outstanding leadership, he became the commander of the torpedo units at Pearl Harbor and actually launched the first torpedo of the war. After the opening battle, he served with the Nagumo Force. He was wounded at Midway while aboard the Akagi but had recovered and now flew as the Shokaku's group leader and the overall commander of the Nagumo Force torpedo planes. Murata was one of Japan's outstanding naval officers. We had the opportunity at Truk to discuss the forthcoming battle in which we were now engaged. "I am grateful, Masatake, for all the work you have done with us in the past," he told me at Truk. "This time especially we are depending on you," he smiled. "The operations command does not always understand the finer points of air attack. Remember the Second Sea Battle of the Solomons. Even those ships on which Mamo, Lieutenant Commander Mamoru Seki, scored direct hits and which were set afire managed to escape. This time I hope the staff will be wise enough to use as many torpedoes as possible. Perhaps then we will be able to avenge our losses at Midway." Murata's 2nd Attack Group reached the enemy warships at approximately 8:25 a.m. and attacked a fleet unit which included one aircraft carrier. Murata encountered the new force about 20 miles southeast of the carrier, which had already been heavily damaged. We received reports from his group that 3 55-pound bombs and at least 2 torpedoes struck a Yorktown-class carrier, and that a battleship was hit with 2 torpedoes and a cruiser with 1 torpedo. We heard Murata give the familiar "all planes go in" command. That was our last contact with him. Lieutenant Sadomu Takahashi of the Zuikaku suddenly discovered an enemy fighter on the tail of his dive bomber. Frantic maneuvers saved him from being shot down, but his plane was so seriously damaged that the rudder jammed and the bomber flew in wide circles. After 6 hours of frustrating circling flight, Takahashi's fuel was nearly exhausted and he decided to abandon the airplane. By a stroke of luck, he sighted one of our tankers and dropped the plane into the water near the ship, which rescued Takahashi and his crew. Lieutenant Yutaka Ishimaru, another former student of mine, was shot up by enemy fighters as he was returning to his carrier. Seriously wounded, he ditched his plane near a destroyer which picked him up. A few minutes later, he died. The Kakuda force listened anxiously to the battle reports of the 1st Carrier Division. The news of the damaging strikes against the 1st Carrier cheered our men, who were anxious to join the assault. Shortly after 10 a.m., Lieutenant Masao Yamaguchi led 18 dive bombers escorted by 12 fighter planes under Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga from the Junyo. Soon afterward, the 2nd Attack Group of 9 torpedo bombers and 5 fighters led by Lieutenant Yoshiaki Irikian took off. One of the fighter plane leaders, Lieutenant Shigematsu, was forced to return to the carrier because of mechanical difficulties. There was talk among the other pilots of the unusual mechanical trouble. Shigematsu waited impatiently on deck for engine repair and took off alone to rejoin his planes. A courageous fighter at Midway who survived the loss of the Hiryu, Shigematsu realized the vital role even one experienced pilot could play in a large-scale air battle. A little past the noon hour, the 1st Attack Force sighted a burning enemy aircraft carrier and several other warships, but failed to sight the 2nd carrier which had been reported in the area. The attack force leader notified Kakuda that he was going to attack a battleship in the enemy fleet. As his planes formed for the dive-bombing attacks, Kakuda received a message from one of his reconnaissance planes which had sighted an undamaged enemy carrier. Kakuda ordered his planes to attack the carrier. Lieutenant Commander Okada, communications staff officer, transmitted the new order to Lieutenant Yamaguchi. The minutes dragged by, and finally the radio crackled with the familiar combat commands. We heard Yamaguchi's voice. "Enemy aircraft carrier in sight. All planes go in." Aboard the Junyo's bridge, one of the officers grinned and shouted with joy. We now had a chance to destroy two of the largest American carriers. Everything depended upon Yamaguchi's men. Rear Admiral Kakuda smiled at the news of the attack and turned to Okada and me. "Our men have become quite proficient. The ship functions as a team. Perhaps we shall compensate for Midway." As Lieutenant Irikian led the torpedo planes of the second attack group to the scene of action, he learned that the formations preceding his planes had attacked the undamaged carrier. Irikian anticipated that the carrier would either be crippled or sinking before he arrived. His expectations were justified, for when he arrived at 1:15 p.m. the ship was aflame. The lieutenant's planes dove in to attack. 3 torpedoes blew open the carrier's hull for the final strike against the ship. The battle appeared to be entirely in our favour. Once her planes were launched, the Junyo continued toward the enemy ships under full steam with only 3 destroyers as escorts. Kakuda ordered this bold manoeuvre because he wished to shorten the distance between the carrier and the planes returning from the attack. Kakuda was an aggressive fighter. The lessened distance between his carrier and the enemy fleet would permit, if it should prove necessary, additional bombings to be made. In the early afternoon, our lookouts sighted in the eastern sky several small planes rapidly approaching the Junyo. The planes skimmed just over the waves, so low that our radar failed to pick them up. We could not identify the aircraft and alerted the ship for air attack. Finally, we identified the first plane as friendly. The pilot rocked the airplane, raising and lowering his wingtips to identify himself. He was a stray who had lost his own carrier. Shortly afterward, the Junyo's planes began to return. Lookouts sighted the planes struggling toward the carrier. Only 6 Zeros flew formation. The remainder flew in from all directions. We searched the sky with apprehension. There were only a few planes in the air in comparison to the number launched several hours before. We could see only 5 or 6 dive bombers. The planes lurched and staggered onto the deck, every single fighter and bomber bullet-holed. Some planes were literally flying sieves. As the pilots climbed wearily from their cramped cockpits, they told of unbelievable opposition, of skies choked with anti-aircraft shell bursts and tracers. Amidst the confusion of the returning planes, Kakuda turned to me. "Air staff, go to the hangar deck and see how many of our remaining planes can be sent out immediately for further attacks." The Admiral had only one thought in mind. He wanted that carrier. Flight Officer Yoshio Sakinaga was occupied with the landing planes and could not leave his post. I ran down the 3 long ladders to the hangar deck where the mechanics attended to the battered airplanes. Of all the planes aboard the Junyo, including the strays from the 1st Carrier Division, only 6 dive bombers and 9 fighter planes were in condition to fly. Kakuda ordered a 3rd attack to be launched as soon as the planes were armed and fueled. The carrier's captain, Okada, sent the orders throughout the ship. "Prepare 9 fighters and 6 dive bombers for attack. Planes will take off immediately after servicing." Lieutenant Commander Sakinaga assembled his pilots for the mission and assigned Lieutenant Shiga, the Junyo's flight group leader, to lead the new flight. Lieutenant Ayao Shirane of the Zuikaku, who had made a forced landing on our ship, also received orders to fly with the group. Shirane was a veteran warrior who had fought in China and who had led the Nagumo Force's fighter planes into Pearl Harbor. He was an outstanding fighter pilot who came from a distinguished Japanese family. Skilled, well-educated, and of unusual build, he commanded the respect of his fellow flyers. The 8 fighter pilots who would fly again for the 3rd time today were more than pleased to have Shirane with them. The dive bomber unit had lost its leaders, Lieutenants Yamaguchi and Naohiko Miura. The surviving senior pilot was Lieutenant J.G. Shunko Kato, a young officer with an unusually childlike face. Because of his weight, his fellow pilots jokingly called him Ton-chan, or Fat Pig. Kato was the youngest reconnaissance officer assigned to the Junyo. His baby face and cheerful disposition made him one of the most popular men aboard the ship. When the third attack was ordered, however, Kato was anything but cheerful. Today was his first experience in battle against an enemy carrier force, and Kato had literally gone through hell. Enemy fighter plane attacks and the incredible anti-aircraft defences had taken a heavy toll on Kato's friends. His own plane had been hit many times, and he had narrowly escaped death on several occasions on his first missions. When he reported the details of the dive bomber attack to Captain Tametsugu Okada, Kato was so shaken that at times he could not speak coherently. Young and lacking experience in circumstances where his friends died all around him, he had suffered a nasty shock. Less than a half hour after he completed his report, the Admiral issued the new attack orders. I found Kato in the aircrew waiting room on the flight deck and told him he was to fly again. To our astonishment, Kato rose from his seat and asked, "Again? Am I to fly again today?" He could not believe, after the terrible losses we had suffered, that he would be ordered to return to the carnage he had gratefully left. It was difficult for me to explain to someone like Kato why he had to fly again. I remained on the ship. Lieutenant Shiga jumped to his feet and shouted across the room, "Ton-chan, this is war! There can be no rest in our fight against the enemy. We cannot afford to give them a chance when their ships are crippled. Otherwise, we will face those same ships again. We have no choice. We go." A veteran of China, Shiga fought at Pearl Harbor and in the Aleutians, and since that time had served with me in the Kakuda force. Ever since the Aleutians attack, he had been the Junyo's fighter unit leader. Even now he was preparing to take off with the few remaining planes. Kato stood silently and then stated simply, "I will go." He was not a coward. He had been unnerved by his shattering introduction to actual combat, and, in a weak moment, he needed the harsh but sincere assistance of his senior officer. I silently thanked the fates which allowed me, on this ship at least, the company of experienced and capable officers. We had avoided what could have been a serious blow to the morale of the ship. Kato would be all right. Before takeoff, the young pilot addressed his dive bomber crews. "We are about to leave for our third attack mission of the day. Our mission is to destroy the enemy's aircraft carriers. Follow me when I attack. Take your planes as low as possible to assure hits. That is all. Man your planes." All through the preparations for the third attack, Admiral Kakuda did not utter a single word. His subordinates carried out their tasks quickly and efficiently. The Junyo was a good ship. Kakuda ordered full steam ahead in the direction of the enemy. That was his only message to his men. So long as the ship continued on this course, every airplane capable of taking off from the deck would be launched to attack the enemy forces. If it were necessary, Kakuda would not hesitate to sail his ship directly into the enemy fleet and ram the largest enemy carrier he could find. Kakuda was a hard but courageous taskmaster. The third attack force took off to deliver the coup de grace. By late afternoon, several hours had gone by without any attacks against the Nagumo force. We estimated that by this time the Zuikaku's third attack force should have completed its missions, and, were this true, Kato's small force would be the only air attack strength remaining of both the American and Japanese battle fleets. It was a ludicrous situation, for Kato controlled greater power than any of the dreadnoughts, cruisers, and other warships on the vast ocean surface below him. I regretted that I could not be in his place. I would have given anything to be flying that lead dive bomber. But I never flew at the controls of a plane again after my last crash. I was no longer strong enough to handle the plane. I could not help but feel uncomfortable, for I remained on the ship while Kato and his men followed my orders. Every man on the Junyo had his heart with Kato. Everyone waited, anxious and quiet, for the first reports to come in. The first metallic words over the radio startled us. "Enemy aircraft carrier is now in sight." Then silence, and the familiar cheering words, "All planes go in." How many times this day had we heard the last command before combat? Now only 6 dive bombers of the former Great Air Fleet were left to execute the order. On the bridge of the Junio, we sweated out the next reports. The minutes dragged by. Officers and crewmen paced back and forth silently. I stayed close to the speaking tube which led to the radio room, waiting for the first news. Suddenly the tube roared into life. "Succeeded in bombing! The attack is successful!" The commander called to the communications room. "Is Kato still flying?" Then silence, and the cheerful single word to us as he put down the phone. "Good." An hour later, we sighted the first returning plane. The sky was darkening quickly, and the blinking red and green lights in the wings of the bomber grew brighter as the plane glided in for its landing. A flushed and triumphant Kato climbed down from his bullet-riddled bomber. The day's operations were completed. Our men had fought continually and had suffered severe losses in their attacks against the enemy carriers. I summarized the day's events in my personal memo book. The efficient radio communications between the carriers and airborne planes allowed the first attack force to locate a new enemy aircraft carrier. In the vicinity of the carrier, broken clouds were thickening at 7,000 feet. Lieutenant Shiga discovered the enemy ship through the clouds, but soon lost sight of the vessel because of the rapidly forming cloud masses. Lieutenant Yamaguchi dove toward the sea in an attempt to find the enemy warship, but soon became lost in the swirling banks. Finally, breaking into the clear, he discovered an enemy battleship directly beneath him and released his bombs. He scored several direct hits, and the other pilots in the formation attacked cruisers which were nearby. Consequently, only a part of the original force which finally found the carrier was available to attack the ship. Fighters which later flew over the combat scene reported the carrier in flames. We judged that the second torpedo plane unit had succeeded in breaking through a fierce anti-aircraft defense and intercepting fighter planes to score at least 4 or 5 torpedo strikes against the burning warship. The attack was extremely costly, for only 2 of the planes of our torpedo force returned to their ship. As the third attack failed to arouse enemy fighter opposition, we confirmed our estimated direct hits against the ship. These reports were brought in by the fighter pilots who flew escort high above the dive and torpedo bombers. The battle proved so intense and enemy opposition so severe that the bomber crews were unable to assess the results of their attacks. With the operation completed, the Junyo was still steaming at full speed toward the enemy fleet. We had many reports which claimed that both American carriers had gone to the bottom. However, most of these reports were assumptions and could not be confirmed. We must be ready to carry out additional attacks on the following day. All through the night, the weary mechanics and aircrew personnel laboured to prepare their battered airplanes for flight. Admiral Yamamoto was kept fully informed of the battle's progress during his stay at Truk. With the battle clearly in our favour, he ordered the entire fleet to pursue the remaining enemy ships and to take every means of destroying the major combat vessels of the enemy force. This was sweet revenge, for the plight of the enemy fleet fleeing after losing its aircraft carrier strength was exactly what we had experienced, only on a larger scale, at Midway. We could not afford to lose for a moment the advantage we had fought for so desperately. All through the night, as our warships plunged at top speed through the Pacific, we could hear enemy flying boats searching for our fleet. The pursuit became increasingly difficult to maintain. The destroyers escorting the Junyo and the Zuikaku sent out urgent appeals for fuel oil. Their plight was so desperate that they risked enemy attack by sending out direct radio signals. Other vessels began to lag behind, and the fleet's formation began to stretch out. Many of our captains hesitated to race at full speed toward an enemy fleet, which we suspected might harbour yet another aircraft carrier. They did not want to expose their vessels to heavy, unexpected air assault. We had moved recklessly at Midway in almost this same situation, and paid the price for our folly. We could not be sure that a third carrier was not waiting to attack, for our second attack group had encountered enemy fighters after previous planes had poured their bombs and torpedoes into the carriers under attack on the 26th. Because of this overcautious manoeuvring and the reluctance of many commanders, we failed to catch the fleeing enemy warships, although we continued the chase until the morning of the following day. At midnight of the 26th advance, warships were maintaining full speed when they suddenly encountered several enemy destroyers preparing to sink the crippled Hornet. We were under instructions from Combined Fleet Headquarters to capture, if possible, the Hornet, which we knew to be seriously disabled. Our fleet units, however, did not close. At least we confirmed that the Hornet's demise was but a matter of a few minutes. From the Junyo's bridge I saw a red glow lighting the horizon far to the east of our carrier. This I presumed to be the blazing hulk of the sinking American carrier. I wondered at the time how the war might have been changed had our Navy been fortunate enough to have more combat officers like Rear Admiral Kakuda. The other enemy carrier which had been attacked by our planes was the Enterprise. The badly damaged ship managed to make good its escape from our pursuing fleet, and, as we had been warned, we could not afford to allow even a single enemy warship to survive. By the middle of November, the Enterprise had been repaired. The big carrier returned to battle with a vengeance which was stunning. On November 12th, her planes alone delivered the final blow to the battleship Yi, which had been damaged off Guadalcanal, and sent the dreadnought to the bottom. 2 days later, the planes caught and mercilessly bombed the heavy cruiser Kinugasa, which also went down. Also on the 14th, and continuing through the following day, the planes from the Enterprise shattered a valuable transport convoy attempting to fight its way to Guadalcanal with supplies and reinforcements for our beleaguered troops. The Enterprise clearly played the dominant role in halting decisively our Army's third all-out offensive on Guadalcanal. On the morning of October 27th, Kakuda brought the Junyo into fleet formation with the Zuikaku. The all-night repair work of the two carriers gave Kakuda a combined striking force of 44 fighters, 18 dive bombers, and 22 torpedo planes. The reconnaissance planes which had been launched from the two carriers before dawn failed, however, to discover any enemy ships or planes. The fuel situation had become desperate, with the escorting destroyers ready to fall out of formation. The fleet then received an order from Vice Admiral Nagumo to assemble and return to base. Nagumo had left the scene of action when the Shokaku received crippling damage and had ordered Kakuda to command the subsequent air battles. Once he discovered, however, that he could not direct the overall operation from the disabled carrier, Nagumo ordered the big ship to return for repairs to Truk. He transferred to a large destroyer which became his flagship for the general operation. Since our reconnaissance planes could not locate the enemy fleet by the morning of the 27th, Nagumo ordered his scattered vessels to reassemble. Shortly after noon of the same day, the warships regrouped their formations and refueled at sea. Nagumo once again transferred his flag, this time to the Zuikaku. The carrier's commander, Captain Tamateru Nomoto, had run his vessel and commanded the air battles for 3 consecutive days, without sleep, remaining at all times on the bridge of his ship. Nagumo personally offered his thanks to Nomoto for the latter's superhuman efforts. This was the first time in the Navy that a warship commander personally directed the actions of carrier-based planes without his staff, no small feat in itself. Vice Admiral Nagumo ordered a special conference held aboard the Zuikaku as the ship returned to Truk to discuss in detail the sea and air battle of the 26th. I attended the conference as the Kakuda's forces representative. When boarded the Zuikaku, I went directly to pay my respects to Nagumo. He was on the bridge, his face wan and drawn, and in deep thought. It was hard to ascertain the Admiral's thoughts, but obviously he had thrown off the apathetic feeling which had weighed upon him after the Midway defeat. Pleased that we had discharged Admiral Yamamoto's trust, Chief of Staff Kusaka warmly praised the accomplishments of the Kakuda force. Kasuka was in a genial mood, and indeed the entire staff attending the conference rejoiced in the newly won victory. For me, the price we had paid was bitter. Lieutenant Commanders Seki and Murata, old and good friends, were gone forever. Even as the conference compared notes, we did not know accurately the losses our own ships and planes had sustained. Some of our men had landed on other carriers, several reconnaissance planes had set down on our Solomons bases, and the crews of a number of planes which had ditched had been picked up by surface vessels. The data submitted to the conference enabled us to arrive at these tentative conclusions. We based the estimates for the enemy carrier losses on the confirmation of the Hornet's sinking and, the following morning, on the fact that our reconnaissance planes could not find any enemy carriers. The planes, however, did sight a large slick in the immediate vicinity, where an enemy carrier had been reported as fiercely burning. We were forced to rely upon such information because we had lost 2 of our 3 dive bomber leaders, all 3 leaders of the torpedo planes, and many other important officers. Up to the time of this battle, both the Americans and the Japanese had lagged badly in shipboard defences against aerial attacks. Commencing with this conflict, however, anti-aircraft defence rapidly improved in quality and quantity. This sudden increase in the defence available to the enemy ships was felt to account for the exorbitant losses sustained by our planes. Because we had lost so many of our experienced men, the conference had no choice but to accept the reports of young officers who were prone to allow the excitement of battle to colour their observations. We could not follow any other course but to base our future plans on what these young officers reported to us. Much later we discovered that our estimates were far from accurate. The Hornet eventually went to the bottom, sunk by the destroyers Mustin, Anderson, and our 4 destroyers. The destroyer Porter also was sunk. These 2 ships, however, were the only vessels which did go down. The second carrier to be attacked — there were only 2, not 3 carriers — was the Enterprise. Contrary to our pilot reports, the ship did not receive any torpedo hits, and its damage was confined to 3 direct bomb hits which, fortunately, inflicted serious damage to the vessel. The reports of the torpedo hits are understandable. Superb manoeuvring by the Enterprise's captain permitted him to escape our torpedoes, which slipped within a hair's breadth of the ship. Our planes also damaged the battleship South Dakota, which bristled with new defensive armament, and the destroyers Smith and the San Juan. We lost approximately 140 men in combat, most of them irreplaceable veterans. American personnel losses of aircrews amounted to about 100 men. Despite the gross over-evaluations, we had inflicted telling blows upon the American warships. The sea battle henceforth was officially titled the Sea Battle in the South Pacific, and Imperial General Headquarters made much of the victory. Since the outbreak of the war, the United States had made constant anti-Japanese propaganda radio broadcasts. When I was aboard the Ryujo off the Aleutians, I heard William Winter's broadcast, which ridiculed the Nagumo force as Ahodori, or the foolish bird. Winter crowded long and loud, presumably with justification, since Nagumo's ships had been overwhelmingly defeated at Midway. This morning, at exactly 6 a.m. on October 26th, I laughed aloud at Winter's words when he admitted that never in its history had the American Navy had so little cause to celebrate its Navy Day. The battle was over, and although we had suffered grievously in losing many of our best pilots, the enemy fleet had been soundly defeated. The victory was to be short. This was our only decisive conquest since Midway, and it was to be the last. By mid-1943, we could no longer ignore the visible deterioration of the Pacific War situation. We still maintained powerful army forces, and our navy posed a dangerous threat with its surface fleet. Despite this land-sea power, however, enemy attacks rapidly depleted our available planes, and it was obvious to all that without mastery of the air, Japan could no longer hope successfully to conclude the war. Our loss of air control centered directly about the situation with reference to the Zero fighter. Early in the war, and, in fact, until the later stages of the Guadalcanal battle, the Zero clearly demonstrated its superior performance over enemy fighter planes. The Americans, however, bent every effort to augment and replace their inferior fighters with new planes of outstanding performance, and soon the Zero met increasing numbers of remarkably fast and powerful enemy fighters. In the interim, we were forced to retain the Zero as our frontline fighter. The Navy did not have a suitable successor to the Zero, nor did the Army have an airplane which could favourably contest the American planes. As the war continued, the dwindling number of Zeros were forced to fight under the most difficult circumstances against such planes as the Army Air Force's P-38, which was faster, could outclimb and outside the Zero, and featured high-altitude performance, all coupled with heavy firepower, self-sealing fuel tanks, and armor plating. Soon there appeared the Navy's F-4U fighter, the first enemy single-engined airplane clearly to outperform the Zero, notably in maximum speed and in diving speed. The second direct cause of our loss of air control was the numerical superiority of the American fighters in the South Pacific, then the main war theatre. The rapid diminution of our air strength is evident in a running summary of the Pacific War in the year following Admiral Yamamoto's death, when Admiral Minaichi Koga became Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet. Koga's first planned large operation was stopped in its tracks. In May of 1943, an American force invaded Attu Island in the Aleutians Chain. If successful, the invasion would cut the defense chain we had established across the Pacific. Koga planned a massive aerial counterattack to drive the enemy back to the mid-Aleutians, and for this campaign concentrated the major strength of the fleet in Tokyo Bay. The enemy's rapid moves, however, caught Admiral Koga off balance, and, before he could make his bid for the counterattack, the Americans controlled Attu. 1 month later, the Americans began a powerful assault against Rabaul, rolling northward through the Solomon Islands from Guadalcanal. By November, the enemy secured his forces on the southern half of Bougainville Island, threatening our positions in the entire area. Another massive enemy thrust crushed our defences in the Gilbert Islands, and this too became an American bastion. Seemingly in coordination with this move, the American and Australian forces in the New Guinea area intensified their air, ground, and sea attacks. The furious tempo of air and ground fighting visibly reduced our available fighting forces and weapons. By late 1943, the enemy assaulted our positions on the Mercus Peninsula in the western end of New Britain, the very island on which lay our Rabaul airfield. We could now appreciate at first hand the incredible power of the American military machine, for despite furious and courageous defensive fighting and counterattacks, the enemy ground his way northward. By the close of 1943, we were in a precarious position. Our Zeros no longer showed themselves over enemy territory, for every venture against enemy positions met awaiting swarms of high-performance American fighters. Indeed, our pilots were hard-pressed even to maintain air control directly over Rabaul. Both quantity and quality played a direct part in this constant reduction in our air strength, for the American Navy now threw into combat its deadly Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter plane. Appearing for the first time in November of 1943, the Hellcats increased rapidly in number. Not only were they superior to the Zero, but our pilots faced literally hordes of the new enemy planes. In late January of 1944, the enemy took the Marshall Islands and, several weeks later, stormed ashore on the Green Islands, some 130 nautical miles east-southeast of Rabaul. Even as the troops hurled our own forces back into the jungles and mountains of these islands, the American engineers performed miracles of air-base construction and again established new fields from which to increase air attacks. The Americans demonstrated their mushrooming power on February 17th with an irresistible carrier raid against Truk Island, our Navy's largest and most powerful naval base in the inner southern Pacific. Disdainful of even the fierce opposition they confronted, the carrier planes wreaked chaos throughout our installations. 6 days later, flushed with victory, a carrier task force hurled hundreds of planes against our Mariana Island air bases and again sowed a path of terrible destruction. By this time we tottered on the brink of total defeat in the southern Pacific. Enemy Army Air Force planes slashed by day and night at our installations, and unbelievably powerful carrier task forces roamed the Pacific, striking where and when they desired. By February 20th, our position at Rabaul was no longer tenable, and our Naval Air Force units abandoned the island. This evacuation drew down the curtain on 2 years of the greatest air battles of the Pacific War, which began with our occupation of Rabaul in January of 1942. The remainder of this section describes in detail how many of the air battles were fought in the Solomons and Rabaul theatre, for the most part taken from my Okumiya's personal experiences in the area. These episodes reveal the transition of power from the Zero fighter to the enemy, representing, as it were, the yielding of strength on our part to the enemy across the entire Pacific. Simultaneously with the American invasion of Attu Island in May of 1943, enemy counterattacks and island invasions in the Solomons increased steadily in tempo. On June 30th, a vast assembly of ships poured men and supplies ashore on Wendover Island. This latest invasion directly imperiled Rabaul, and Admiral Koga ordered all the air groups of the 2nd Carrier Division, then at Truk, immediately to transfer south to our base at Rabaul and to Buin in southern Bougainville. Rear Admiral Munetaka Sakamaki assumed command of the assembled air groups. At the time, I was the air staff officer to Admiral Sakamaki. In the Central Solomons and East New Guinea, our forces waged furious battles, retreating steadily before the aggressive enemy attacks. The jungle ground became red with blood of our troops who, despite every effort, could not stem the relentless enemy drives. The Navy Air Force, centered at the Buin Air Base, made every effort to destroy the enemy air units then based at Guadalcanal and to provide air cover for our land forces and surface vessels in the area. To maintain an air blanket over our forces was in itself a major undertaking, for American planes in round-the-clock attacks hammered at troops and ships. Consequently, the air battles centered about our Buin Air Base developed into violent day and night raids by both forces. The campaign was deadly, for the stakes included the entire southern Pacific, and perhaps the war's outcome. Both the United States and Japan concentrated their main air strength in the theatre. Buin, a wretched air base, not comparable in airfield facilities to the enemy's magnificent engineering achievements. Our pilots had only one runway, 4,000 feet long and 800 feet in width, running at a right angle to the coast. Extending from each side of the airstrip were numerous small roads leading into the jungle, where we concealed the majority of our planes from aerial observation. Each night we moved every plane from the field into the jungle revetments, and, during the day, did the same, except for those ships which were on call. This dispersion kept our losses from enemy bombing and strafing to a minimum. Our Air Force headquarters and sleeping quarters were located on the beach, approximately a mile and a half west of the field. Our quarters were simply barracks, or more accurately, tents scattered haphazardly over the ground. We raised the floors about 6 feet above the soil for protection against the severe heat and moisture. I remained at Buin approximately 3 months, from July to September 28, 1943. During this time I kept detailed notes of our harassed life at this jungle air outpost. The daily activity at the air base begins at least 3 hours before sunrise. In the steaming humidity, surrounded by insects, the mess crews begin the task of preparing meals for the day. Most of the maintenance crews also arise at this time to prepare the planes for the day's missions. The work of our mechanics is most strenuous, for they must bring all the aircraft which are to fly that day from their jungle revetments onto the field. One by one the planes move from the jungle cover, a band of men tugging and pushing the heavy aircraft over the soft ground. Everything must be done by hand. There is not a single tractor on the field. 2 hours later, with 60 minutes yet to go before the sun shows over the horizon, the entire field awakens and all men take their posts. The pilots and the aircrew members carry their flying gear to the assembly point, which is the flight personnel pool near the runway. Here they eat their breakfast while they await the orders of the day. Even as the pilots receive their briefings, reconnaissance planes bound for routine search missions in the Guadalcanal area thunder along the runway and disappear into the brightening sky. By now, every Zero fighter in flying condition is ready for an immediate takeoff to defend the base against attacking enemy planes. The Zeros are fueled and armed, placed along the runway so that the pilots have only to fly straight ahead to take off. The standby fighter pilots wait near the personnel shack, listening to the radio reports from our reconnaissance planes and from the distant ground-watching stations on the islands close to the enemy's airfields. Now the loudspeaker blares its warning. The outermost watching stations have sighted enemy planes wheeling into formation over their bases and heading for our area. The fighter commander checks the reports of each station, estimating the enemy plane's time of arrival. He waits until the last possible moment before ordering the Zeros into the air. The fighters rock and bounce slightly as they roll along the runway, then faster, the motors thundering, dust streaming behind the planes. Then they are in the air, dwindling to small black specks, and finally disappearing as they claw for altitude. They will wait high above the field so that they can dive out of the sun against the enemy formations. Superior altitude in launching an attack can decide the outcome of the air battle. The base is quiet now. The only sounds are the metallic crackle of the loudspeaker, the hammering of mechanics, and the voices of men. Suddenly the lookout on our tower stiffens behind his binoculars. His voice carries to the ground. We see him pointing to the south. Yes, there they are. Enemy planes, fast approaching the airbase. The siren screams its warning, and the men on the field dash for cover, never too soon, as the enemy bombers close on the field with great speed. No one really stays down in the ditches and culverts. Hundreds of men stare at the sky, seeing the bombers and searching for the Zeros which should even now be diving against the enemy planes. Here they come, racing from their greater height to break up the bomber formations. But even before they reach the slower, heavier planes, the escorting enemy fighters scream upward to intercept the Zeros. No matter how determined the Zero attacks, the bombers maintain their formations. Even as the Zeros and American fighter planes scatter over the sky in swirling dogfights, we can hear the rapidly increasing shriek of the falling bombs. The earth shakes and heaves. Great blossoms of fire, steel, smoke and dirt erupt from the airfield as salvos of bombs walk across the revetments and the runway. Sharp sound cracks against the eardrums, and the concussion is painful. Our own machine gunners fire in rage at the droning bombers above, even as the explosions come faster and faster. There is the rumble of bomber engines, the rising and falling whine of the fighters, the stutter of machine guns, and the slower chuck-chuck of aerial cannon. The sky is filled with dust and flame and smoke. Planes on the field are burning fiercely, and wreckage is scattered across the runway, which by now is cratered with great holes. Through the smoke we can see the hurtling fighter planes, diving and climbing in mortal combat. Our men curse or only stare silently as we watch Zeros suddenly flare up in scarlet and orange flame, and then plunge from the sky like bizarre shooting stars, leaving behind them a long trail of angry flame and black, oily smoke. Parachutes can be sighted drifting earthward, clearly silhouetted against the deep blue sky. Then, abruptly, the raid is over. The crashing, earth-heaving thunder of the bombs is gone. As soon as the last bomb has expanded its fury, the ground crews clamber from their air raid shelters and with shovels in their hands race for the runway. They work frantically, sweat pouring from their bodies, ignoring the ever-present mosquitoes and flies, shoveling dirt back into the craters, rushing to patch up the field so that the damaged Zero fighters can land. The men jump aside as the crippled fighters, metal skin torn and holed by enemy bullets, stagger toward the runway. Most of them land safely, but every so often a badly damaged fighter spins under a collapsed landing gear or flips over on its back. As soon as it has stopped rolling, each arriving plane is surrounded by the maintenance crews. They push the fighters off the runway one by one and immediately refuel the tanks and load fresh machine gun bullets and cannon shells. The pilots, weary from another early morning encounter, assemble at the command post where the intelligence officers record their reports of the fight. As soon as the conference ended, the pilots returned to the assembly pool. These daily attacks are a familiar story. Even now our attack bomber group is waiting for takeoff. Finally, the reconnaissance planes report the most favourable targets, and the bombers trundle down the runway and soar into the air. The Zeros will be flying close escort. The American fighters are becoming tougher every day. The long day passes. The gathering dusk is a welcome sight, for it means some rest and at least respite from heavy raids. Neither we nor the enemy has the proper equipment to permit large-scale night attacks. Once the sun has set, the air crews, back from their missions, walk wearily to their respective sleeping quarters. Not, however, the maintenance crews. Their full day of work is no assurance of relaxation and sleep. The planes which have fought today are riddled with bullet holes, shrapnel and gaping cannon tears in the wings and fuselage. Motors grind noisily and must be brought to smooth operation. Sheet metal work must be done. Machine guns which have jammed must be cleared, brakes tightened or replaced, radio sets repaired, new sheets of clear plastic put in the bullet-riddled nose sections. The maintenance crews are exhausted, but they drag their weary bodies about the field, heaving and tugging to move the planes back into the jungle. They pray for tractors such as the Americans have in abundance, but they know their dream of such luxuries will not be fulfilled. 3 hours after the sun has gone down, the mechanics and technicians emerge red-eyed and haggard from the jungle to take their supper. It is blue-black twilight now, and the men eat, too tired to talk to one another, groping for their food in the darkness imposed by air raid blackout orders. Hot, sweaty, dirty and tired, they eat their food and walk to their sleeping quarters. They are too weary to read, or to write letters, or even to talk very much to each other. Sleep is their only concern, and they fall heavily to their mats. It is dark now, and the field is quiet. Maybe, if we are lucky, it will be a restful evening. Before long we know differently. Even as the siren screams, we hear the distant sound of approaching bombers. Anti-aircraft guns cough raucously at the black shapes far above, and dazzling searchlight beams stab through the sky, swinging in circles to search for the raiders. A series of tremendous explosions smashes at the eardrums. Again the earth heaves and shakes, and dust and smoke shower over the entire field. Perhaps there is only one airplane up there, circling the field, dropping a bomb every now and then, but he keeps us awake for hours, and before he leaves, another nocturnal raider takes his place. Eventually the ear-splitting shock waves and the thunder leave. Again the field is quiet. This does little good. The mechanics and other ground crewmen curse the day, still black, as they begin another exhausting period of work. And this is but one day, typical of the seemingly endless succession of day and night periods, filled only with work, exhaustion, the ceaseless enemy attacks, and the ever-increasing number of pilots and air crewmen who do not return. When the 2nd Carrier Division, commanded by Rear Admiral Sakamaki, to which I was attached as Air Staff Officer, arrived at Buin, we found the 26th Air Flotilla already on the field. The two headquarters groups coordinated their activities, and I was assigned responsibility for night raids. All pretense at a normal workday vanished, and I would be called on to work at any hour of the day or night. Since I had to work with the moon, which rises at different times each night, I found regular sleep impossible. Here my long training stood me in good stead, for soon I could snatch sleep at any time, whether it was light or dark, and for any interval. I could sleep as well for 20 minutes as I could for 3 hours. Without this ability to relax under any conditions, I would have broken down physically and perhaps mentally. Usually I arose about 1.5 hours before the time scheduled for the departure of our planes. Without washing or breakfast, I groped through the blackout to the radio station. Here I checked the positions of enemy surface vessels, land-based air units, and the expected weather. With an hour to go before takeoff, I would then drive to the field's command post. Unless special conditions warranted their absence, our commander, the senior staff officer, and the command staff would remain directly on the base. Each time I arrived at the command post, I would hear the mechanics warming up the engines of the planes scheduled to fly. I could see the blue-white flashes of flame spitting from the exhaust pipes, the only light visible on the entire base. 30 minutes before takeoff, Captain Sake Yamamoto, the 582nd Air Corps commander, briefed his air crews under a dim electric bulb at the command post. Although I often advised the captain, I never gave orders directly to the pilots and crew members. That was not my job, for I remained in the background, studying carefully the facial expressions and the actions of our flying personnel. My responsibility was to ascertain their morale and physical condition. Finally, Yamamoto gave the order to take off. One by one, the planes rumbled down the field and lifted into the darkness. All work was carried out through signals, a simple flash of light between the command post and the takeoff line. The runway itself was shrouded in black. At the extreme end, one could barely make out two dimly glowing lights, shielded from above, marking the end of the runway to the pilots. With the last plane gone, we snatched some rest on cots at the command post, waiting on call in the event that any of the planes were forced to turn back. The CP rose like a fire watch tower to a height of 67 feet, and its top matched the height of the surrounding jungle trees. Atop the tower was the lookout station. The actual command headquarters rested within the tower, about 11 feet off the ground. Our working space was little bigger than a wrestling ring. During an enemy attack, the CP was filled with men and became a centre of utter confusion. There was little room, even if everyone were to remain still, to use mosquito netting. We could protect ourselves from the vicious insects only by covering our bodies with a raincoat. In the muggy atmosphere, we perspired profusely. The lower parts of our bodies were protected by long, heavy trousers and pilot's boots, which we did not take off even when sleeping. The hours always passed by slowly. Our lookout finally identified the returning bombers, which showed a coded light signal. The landing procedure was seldom uneventful, for often courageous American pilots would trail our bombers back to the base, flashing the light signal similar to that used by the bombers. We had to be absolutely alert at all times, for the favourite American trick was to scream down upon the field in a surprise attack. Once we brought the first bomber in for a successful landing, then signalled the second plane to make its approach. The airplane drifted toward the ground in a normal landing run. Suddenly we heard the sound of motors being pushed to full throttle, and the Japanese bomber came into view as an enemy night intruder, machine guns spitting tracers into the command post and over the field. Fortunately, in this attack I escaped injury, but we lost several maintenance crewmen and suffered damage to some airplanes. The American pilots were the most adventurous flyers I have ever encountered. Apparently they would stop at nothing. As our planes landed and were pushed into their jungle revetments, I interviewed the pilots and aircrews. With the data from every man condensed into an intelligence report, I radioed all units concerned with the information obtained on the night raids. Before I realized it, the darkness was fading before the first signs of dawn. Another day. When there was no moonlight to guide our planes on night raids, we modified the attacks so that the planes would be able to strike at dawn or at dusk. If we attacked at dusk, the planes could leave during daylight and attack their objectives under conditions of good visibility, but they also ran the risk of enemy fighter interception. The dawn attacks required split-second timing, for if the planes were forced by weather to postpone their takeoff, usually they could not arrive over the target until the sun was up, reducing the favourable element of surprise. Therefore we now used also the airstrip on Kolombangara Island, which lay close to Munda, where our troops were engaged in bitter fighting with the enemy. Not only did this new arrangement raise the morale of the Marines at the base, isolated along the front lines, but the ground crews at Kolombangara now had some work to perform for the first time in many weeks. In mid-August, 4 Kates led by Lieutenant J.G. Takahashi arrived secretly at the Kolombangara airstrip, sliding into the field just at dusk. Even though the airstrip personnel knew the planes were on their way, a runway pitted with holes from repeated air attacks greeted the pilots. They were apprehensive about landing, for each Kate carried a 1,760-pound bomb for the next day's attack. After circling the field slowly and noting the location of the craters, the 4 Kates finally made precarious but safe landings. The pilots and crew members could scarcely believe their eyes when they descended from their planes. The maintenance crews which greeted them stared from bloodshot eyes. They were bearded and unkempt, and their short pants were filthy. Malnutrition had pulled back the skin on their faces and bodies. They ran tender hands over the planes they had not seen for so many months, and could not help crying with joy after their long isolation. The bomber crews bedded down for the evening, which, as always, brought with it hordes of mosquitoes and other insects. The mosquito nets which the mechanics respectfully offered them were rags, utterly useless, and the pilots and crew members tossed and turned the entire night, besieged by insect swarms. To Lieutenant Takahashi's astonishment, the airbase personnel slept soundly through the night. Despite their lack of netting and the consequent exposure to the mosquitoes, they awoke refreshed and eager to service the Kates. Takahashi's group took off early in the morning and successfully bombed the enemy objectives. Returning to Buin, which we had long despaired of as probably the worst air bases in the Pacific, Takahashi vowed never to complain again. He described to his fellow pilots in detail the terrible conditions at Kolombangara, compared to which Buin was an engineering paradise. The absence of ground fighting near the Buin air base allowed us one pleasure, the luxury of bathing. This was in fact the only pleasant aspect of life at the jungle airstrip, and even to enjoy this we had to squeeze in our bathing time within the space of about 30 minutes after the daily battles. Eventually the Americans intensified their attacks and raided Buin at any time of the day or night. Frantic movements to extricate oneself from a tub because of flaming tracers soon made us forego even this last moment of relaxation. I must give credit where it is rightfully due. The American pilots who raided Buin were some of the bravest flyers I have ever seen. They flew at treetop level, racing at great speed over the field, their machine guns spraying lead and tracers into every possible target. The loss of merely the pleasure of bathing may appear as a trivial matter to the reader. However, we lived under the most primitive conditions, without decent food, yearning for rest, besieged day and night by American bombers and fighters, waging a battle which could have but one outcome, watching our friends leaving on missions never to return, suffering from jungle diseases, annoyed day and night by insects. With this in mind, then, perhaps this fervour, at least to be clean, can better be understood. Finally, our dreams of pure luxury centred about an uninterrupted bath and an evening's sound slumber beneath several layers of mosquito netting, with bright lights all about us instead of the dreary blackout. At this time, the only serious land battles being fought in the Pacific area raged in our area and along the east coast of New Guinea. Large-scale air battles were fought mainly between the American planes from Guadalcanal and our Buin-based forces. We were the one force which held back the mounting enemy pressure, and, were we to fail, the Americans would burst northward from Guadalcanal. As the director of the air battles in the area, I prepared the communiques for release by the Imperial General Staff, Daihone, in Japan. One such communique, as an example, read, "News flash on air battles by the Buin Area Air Force, Buin. An air group of 12 Type 99 carrier-based dive bombers and 48 Zero fighters, led by Lieutenant J.G. Tachibana, left this base at 0600 hours today to search for a large enemy convoy. One of our reconnaissance planes on the night of the 14th sighted the enemy fleet moving north in the sea south of Rendova Island. Our aerial formations sighted an enemy landing force off the east coast of Vella Lavelle, believed to be the enemy convoy previously sighted at sea. Lieutenant Tachibana led the dive bombers and the fighters in an attack against the enemy force, despite interception with approximately 50 enemy planes. Our bombers sank 2 large and 1 small transport ships and damaged 2 large and 2 small transport ships. We shot down 7 enemy planes and damaged 5. Our losses included 5 Type 99 dive bombers and 3 Zero fighters. Lieutenant Tachibana gave his life in the attack. Our force will return to Vella Lavella again today to press bombing attacks against the enemy landing ships." The government released this news flash to the public immediately after the enemy established a beachhead on August 15th at Vella Lavella. We mounted 3 attacks against the invasion force, placing over the target area a total of 141 Zero fighters, 36 Val bombers, 23 Betty twin-engined bombers, and 20 seaplanes. On the evening of the day when I sent the news report to Imperial General Headquarters, we listened to the radio broadcast to our people. The program opened with a recording of the Navy March, after which the announcer repeated my news flash verbatim. When I heard that more than half the program time was allotted to my report, I first realized to what extent I could control the feelings of our people at home. On September 1st, the Navy ordered the commander of 26th Air Flotilla to return with his staff to Japan, and directed Admiral Sakamaki and his staff to assume the combat responsibilities of the departing flotilla. As the division air staff officer, I assumed the air operations duties which had been conducted by the flotilla's air officer. We now were the only remaining high-echelon headquarters unit in close proximity to the enemy, for which I comprised the entire air staff. What the situation actually indicated was that our planes were the only force left to face the main body of American air strength in the area. Our conduct would reflect accurately the national air strength of my country. From this moment on, I no longer recognized night or day. Often I worked right through stretches of 48 hours or more, laboring to dispatch my airplanes where they could most effectively attack the enemy and, equally time-consuming, trying to be elsewhere when the American raiders assaulted Buin. My position was anything but unique, for Rear Admiral Sakamaki, Captain Yamamoto, and their immediate staffs were suffering the same tribulations. On September 14th, enemy planes bombed Buin 3 times, placing over the airbase at least 220 planes. The rain of crashing bombs turned the field temporarily into complete chaos. Every available Zero fighter took to the skies to intercept, and many of these planes and their pilots failed to return. The September 14th attacks were the largest fought since my arrival. So severe was the damage to the field, and so great was the number of planes either damaged or wrecked by the enemy bombs, that every single officer and enlisted man worked more than 12 hours without rest or food. We knew only too well that unless we quickly became operational again, we would be at the full mercy of the enemy bombers. By nightfall we had cleared away most of the debris, and the base was returning to normal operations. Despite the damage suffered that day, we dispatched our night bombers on their harassing raids. Our pilots were determined to repay the enemy, at least in part, for his damaging attack. On this particular mission, I was unable personally to dispatch the planes, since I still had to prepare the daily radio report to Tokyo. As usual, I hurried to the field after midnight. The planes were already due, but for some reason Captain Yamamoto and his flight officer failed to appear at the command post. Most probably they had been exhausted by the bombing and were sound asleep. Soon the bombers began to return, assembling over the field. The ground crews did not know what to do. Although the bombers waited for the landing signal lights, only Captain Yamamoto and his flight officer had the authority to order these on. I fidgeted uneasily, for it is intolerable to keep pilots who have just completed a long and grueling night mission circling in the dark. Further, the situation was ready-made for an effective sneak attack by an enemy intruder, and the entire base now was wide awake, waiting with uncertainty for the planes to land. One can never be sure that the planes above are friendly. It was beyond my authority, but as the air staff officer I ordered the ground crews immediately to switch on the landing lights to bring the bombers in. One by one the black raiders slipped onto the airstrip and the signal lights winked out. At that moment Yamamoto and his flight officer came running into the command post. At once I apologized, for to overextend one's authority is a serious matter. Rather than taking offense, the captain was grateful for my intervention. His action was typical. To every one of us, the welfare of the air crews was our primary consideration. Our purpose was to ease as much as possible the burden of the men who carried the fight to the enemy. This required the unhesitating cooperation of all concerned. To do less was to shirk one's responsibility. The air crews, best of all, personified Japan's people in the battlefield, for they came from every walk of life. Some of them carried the names of well-known families, some non-commissioned officers were simple labourers, some were the only sons of their parents. While we maintained strict military discipline on the ground, with proper observance for rank, class and age, those differences no longer existed when a cruise plane lifted its wheels from the ground. The enemy cared little about the groups which constituted our air crews, and there existed no discrimination on the part of the pilot who caught our planes in his sights. Our air crews were closely knit teams, for it mattered not one whit whether an enlisted man or an officer manned the machine guns or cannon. The effect was exactly the same. Unfortunately, this feeling of solidarity of our air crews was unique in the Japanese military organization. The continual air battles against the savagely fighting Americans exacted a heavy and steady toll of our men. The constant fighter plane interceptions and bombing missions meant that hardly a day passed without men dying or receiving serious wounds. The pilots and air crews did not honestly expect to survive their Buin duty tour, for the steady loss of men meant that no one could predict the time of his own passing. I could not understand the attitude of our Navy command, which treated its men with unnecessary harshness and apparent disregard. Of the 150 aircrew members who had arrived 1 month ago with me at Buin, at least 50 were dead. Before another month passed, we were certain that more than 1/2 of the remaining men also would be lost. Even in the costly Guadalcanal beachhead operation, we did not lose more than 1/3 of our personnel. Here at Buin, we suffered most heavily in the loss of our Lieutenant J.G. personnel, who formed the nucleus of the fighter pilots. 13 of these men had arrived in the South Pacific 18 months ago. Only one was still alive. I was not entirely aware of the attitude of these men, either of those who had died or the ones who remained. Perhaps many of the men accepted their fate willingly, with the realization that in sacrificing their lives for their country, they went beyond merely the act of dying. I do not know the answer, but I found it gratifying to see that those who remained to fight, and almost certainly to die, exhibited no signs of psychological disturbance. For our ground forces, it was a different matter. It was not difficult for our troops to whip themselves into emotional frenzies, for there existed no greater honor than to die in defense of their homeland. Perhaps some of our troops obtained their courage from the long-cherished desire to die, as they knew eventually they must, before their comrades with the fearless banzai cry upon their lips. This world of human emotions did not seem to touch our flying personnel. Their courage and solidarity as a team under fire arose from something more profound and lasting. Certainly they realized that if the war conditions did not change drastically, their demise was but a matter of time. Just when that time would come was, of course, the question. They had to continue fighting, ignoring the ever-present spectre of flaming death, simply because there was a task to be done. It was important to our men to be remembered for the brave manner in which they met death against the enemy. Our airmen, who for so long fought a steadily losing battle, often were denied in their last minutes of life the knowledge that their passing would be related at home. On the majority of occasions, the end came without witness by a man's flying mates. Those men who failed to return simply were listed as died in action or failed to return. Despite the lack of what was to them a matter of great consequence, our pilots and airmen fought courageously. The philosopher would state that it is the basic principle of the theory of evolution to be unmindful of one's own destruction for the sake of propagating the species. This is all very well in the classroom, but the philosopher often is conspicuously absent from the battlefield. What is it which allowed our men to act as they did? I cannot answer, and never really will know, but I feel that I saw something wonderful, deep and pure in their eyes, a reflection, perhaps, of the serene peace they knew in their souls. If I am compelled to identify this motivation, I can reply only with the inadequate phrase of love of their country. Could this be classed merely as patriotism? It is difficult to answer. Through my association with these men, I learned that there are those who fight merely for the sake of fighting, who seek out mortal combat with the enemy, who wish to stake their lives against that of the enemy pilots. They did not do this from patriotic motives, but merely because they wanted to fight. This is no longer explained by logic. Had the real conditions of the battleground, with its overwhelming lack of decent facilities for our men, been shown to the people back home, there would have been a terrible outcry against our leaders. The decision for war itself would have been questioned seriously, and perhaps because of this, the war might have ended sooner. And yet, our airmen did not care to shoulder the task of such public enlightenment. Our men were not so lacking in scientific knowledge as to believe in happiness after death. They had enjoyed in their present life what they considered to be the greatest spiritual moments a human being can attain. The matter so disturbed me that on occasion I secretly left my barracks and visited the sleeping quarters of my men. I would contemplate, with little success, the drive behind these courageous airmen. Officers higher than the rank of lieutenant, Japanese Navy division officers, were afforded the luxury of sleeping in 2s and 3s in one room, but the Lieutenant JG personnel crowded 8 together, usually in an old, dirty tent superficially protected by mosquito netting. Our non-commissioned officers also suffered quarters in dilapidated tents, crowded in together. Worst of all, however, were the terrible conditions under which our maintenance crews lived. Their quarters were comparable to the worst jungle slums, and the men slept like sardines in a can, so tightly jammed together that it was impossible for a man to roll over on the damp floors. Tropical rains poured water over their bodies, making sleep impossible. Their mosquito netting amounted to pitiful shreds of cloth, of virtually no use. With poor food, lack of toilet facilities, and jammed quarters, theirs was indeed a miserable lot. We could do nothing to alleviate the terrible conditions, for the few ships which broke through the enemy screen of submarines, warships, and bombers carried only the most essential items. I feared for the health of the aircrew personnel. Even the slightest illness could wreck the smooth teamwork necessary in air combat. The effects of malnutrition especially denied us certain combat advantages. In any aerial engagement, the opponent who first discovers his enemy gains an immediate advantage. Our pilots and crew members, suffering from malnutrition, also underwent a corresponding loss in vision. We had a most forceful demonstration of this handicap. Lieutenant Commander Mochifumi Nango, a distinguished ace in the Sino-Japanese incident, persisted in flying despite marked malnutrition. He was a superb flyer. We were convinced, however, that he did not even see the enemy fighter into which his Claude rammed with terrifying impact. Bowen was in the tropical zone, but lacked the customary native dwellings and, indeed, could only boast cocoa. Neither fruit nor vegetables grew in the forsaken strip of jungle land. At Rabaul and Buka, an island north of Buin, there grew some fresh fruit, but in such niggardly quantities that they could not meet even a fraction of our needs. Every so often I dispatched a transport plane to Kavieng, at the northern tip of New Ireland, with orders to bring back bananas, papayas, and vegetables. The flight required a round trip of more than 800 nautical miles and the use of valuable fuel, but I felt it imperative that our airmen receive at least this minimum quantity of fresh food. Rear Admiral Sakamaki would not take the food, but ordered it distributed only among the pilots and aircrew members. Occasionally, high-ranking officers from our Tokyo headquarters and from Combined Fleet headquarters at Truk would visit Buin to confer with me about the air war in the Buin theatre. I knew that what they learned from me would influence to no small extent the future conduct of our naval air arm, and I was always cautious to answer carefully their every question. One particular interrogation proceeded as follows. We understand that since the 2nd Carrier Division transferred to Buin, air operations in the theatre have suddenly increased. According to our intelligence reports, our raids are causing the enemy great difficulty. Has the present commander employed tactics differing greatly from those of the former commanding officer? Actually, we had not modified our tactics to any unusual extent. The truth of the matter was simply that most of the air staff which preceded us at Buin had suffered severe emotional disturbances. Not only were they exhausted mentally and physically from their grueling work under enemy fire, but the lack of proper housing and food and the murderous climate hastened their collapse. Under such conditions they could not possibly have employed their aircraft effectively against the enemy. I replied, "There has been little change, if any at all. I believe the increased efficiency of our men stems from the fact that our commander receives the unquestioned trust and support of his subordinates. As you realize, the present air battles are fought chiefly by our younger officers and by men below the rank of lieutenant. Frankly, I myself want quite badly to make a reconnaissance flight over Guadalcanal, for personal observation would aid my duties. However, as you are aware, my old wounds do not permit me to make a high-altitude flight. I could be only a burden to a reconnaissance plane, and, as much as I would like once again to fly, I have refrained from doing so. However, Commander Okumiya, as the staff officer in charge of air operations, Haven't you specific ideas you have followed or would like to see put into practice? The question was difficult to answer, but finally I said, "My idea of an air staff officer may differ from the conception you hold. To me, his duties should parallel, if you will pardon my analogy, the task of a sports trainer. The air staff officer should outline his plan of attack, but similarly should bend every effort to ease the work of his airmen. Let us face facts. The air staff officer has no place in actual combat. His every effort should be made to formulate the most effective plan of attack and to provide his men with the greatest chance of survival. I am simply carrying out my duties with this attitude in mind." "Will you elaborate a bit further, Commander?" "Perhaps the best example is found in the manner in which we ordinarily attend to our personnel. Usually everybody takes great care to ensure that the needs of officers are met, but these same people are surprisingly negligent of the cares of the greater majority of our flying personnel, the non-commissioned officers. To me this is foolish, for the best officer is useless in combat unless he has the support of a well-coordinated and able crew. Therefore, I have given every possible minute to devising means to raise the morale of our non-commissioned officers. I have taken special pains to provide these airmen with the food and medicine necessary for their health. Our mechanics bend every effort to maintain our planes in flying condition. Few things are as effective in destroying morale as a lack of aircraft against an enemy who daily grows stronger." "I see. Is there anything that, as the air staff officer, you would specifically like to see done?" "Many things, but of all which I feel should be done, I particularly want to send some of my men back to Japan while they still are in good health. It is unimportant if we return to the homeland only 1 or 2 of our airmen who are not yet ill or wounded. More than 2 months have passed since I arrived at Buin. In all this time, although many more men have since come as replacements, not a single healthy man has left this base. This same situation applies to our maintenance crews, who live under the most primitive conditions. Why? If our personnel could believe only that they had a chance, even the slimmest chance, of returning to Japan before they were seriously wounded or become seriously ill, our morale would soar. The prospect of returning home under conditions other than, so to speak, being carried out on a stretcher would provide a tremendous incentive for work. Another question. Why in the name of heaven does headquarters delay so long in according our combat men the honours they deserve? The most unbelievable acts of courage and bravery before the enemy have gone without notice from Tokyo. From the looks of things, Japan is no more impressed with the man who single-handedly defeats 100 enemy planes than with the administrative clerk who is never fired upon. Look at the methods of our enemies. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the largest enemy airbase in the area, is named after their Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine torpedo bomber pilot who died at Midway. I am impressed with the wisdom of the American method of raising the morale of their fighting men. In contrast, our Navy does absolutely nothing to recognize its heroes. The outstanding men of the Pearl Harbor attack and the Sea Battle of Malaya to this day have not received a single individual honor or citation. These men are now dying one after the other in battle, and their numbers decrease every day. The situation at times becomes ridiculous. Recently, Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka, Commander-in-Chief of the Southeast Area Fleet, was forced to take some steps to recognize one of our pilots. The Admiral awarded an honor sword to Flight Petty Officer Okabe, who in one day shot down 7 enemy planes. Okabe himself was happy to receive this citation, but little is left for his memory, since he died in action several days later. Our aircrew members do not complain or even discuss this lack of recognition or honors for their deeds. Because of this silence especially, I plead that you may convince headquarters to give these men the attention they so rightfully deserve. It is astonishing and perhaps shameful to realize that throughout all World War II, not a single living member of the Japanese armed forces ever received any form of government honor, award, or citation, despite the actions of many men above and beyond their duty to their country. In late September of 1943, I was reassigned as the Air Staff Officer of the 2nd Carrier Division, and soon afterward I returned to Japan. By mid-October, the enemy air raids against the 26th Air Flotilla at Buin had become intolerable. With its base constantly subjected to enemy bombs and strafing attacks, with living facilities reduced to the lowest possible level, and with a mounting loss of supply ships, the Navy pulled out, moving its air strength directly to Rabaul. From October of 1943 to January of 1944, our planes engaged the enemy air units in some of the most bitter airfights of the war. Increased numbers of enemy land and carrier-based fighters and bombers attacked our positions. These were met by planes of the 25th and 26th Air Flotillas and the air groups of the 1st Carrier Division. The Navy could not continue to bear indefinitely the ever-increasing enemy air strength, and our position deteriorated rapidly. The last Rabaul Air Force. During the summer and early fall of 1943, the reorganized 2nd Carrier Division under Rear Admiral Takagi Jojima was forced by a shortage of aviation fuel to reorganize and train its air groups in the Singapore area. With its training barely completed, the division received orders from Admiral Koga to transfer to Truk and arrived at the Pacific Bastion by December. By the close of 1943, the Marshall Islands and Rabaul were perilled by the advancing enemy, whose planes daily filled the skies over our bases. Truk itself was threatened by the approaching bulk of enemy air strength. For the third time, Admiral Koga dispatched the 2nd Carrier Division's air groups to bolster Rabaul's tottering defences. Preceding the main body of planes on January 20th, 1944, I flew to Rabaul to set up my working quarters. In charge of Rabaul's air defence was the 26th Air Flotilla, the air group I had worked with at Buin. After paying my respects to Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka, commander of the new aerial defence operation, I hurried to the flotilla's headquarters to visit my old friends. I was anxious to see the men with whom I had shared the bombings and deprivation at Buin. I was pleased to see that, instead of the ramshackle quarters of Buin, the 26th staff now worked in a splendid native house with a high tropical floor. A section was apportioned off as sleeping quarters, and the building was well furnished. With facilities such as these, obviously the commander and his staff would be able to direct their operations with the greatest efficiency. I did not even wait for my car to stop, but climbed out when it still was moving and ran up the stairs leading into the operations room. The moment I passed through the door, I realized something was wrong. Outwardly, the staff personnel were the same. Nevertheless, they had changed. 6 months ago, they were cheerful and hard workers, despite the rigours of life at Buin. Now they were quick-tempered and harsh, their faces grimly set. The fighting spirit which enabled us to ignore the worst of Buin was gone. The men lacked confidence. They appeared dull and apathetic. No longer were they the familiar, well-functioning team. It was difficult to determine the reason for this startling change. Perhaps it was the never-ending pressure of enemy attacks, or the realization that American troops battered their way closer to Rabaul every day. It was possible that finally they had despaired entirely of victory and were only waiting for the end to come. Their expressions and actions indicated clearly that they wished to abandon Rabaul at the earliest possible moment. Yet despite the American boast that by Christmas their forces would be in Rabaul, the 26th Air Flotilla had somehow managed to hold back the Americans from sweeping over Bougainville Island. Although this was only a defensive action, any respite from the giant war machines pounding its way north in the Pacific could have come only from a great fighting effort. Even the success of this delaying operation failed to buoy the spirits of the headquarters staff. Before long, I could understand the prevalent apathy. I learned that even the Buin attacks could not compare to the devastating enemy assaults against Rabaul. The Americans hurled hundreds of planes in incessant day and night attacks at our crucial base. Sleep became impossible as high-flying bombers and night intruders dropped bombs during the evening. The men were completely exhausted. In the air war raging around Bougainville and Rabaul, the bomber crews were required first to be competent engineers before they could become effective in combat. In the aircraft types employed by our air flotilla, composed of single-seat fighters, two-seat dive bombers, and three-seat level and torpedo bombers, the highest levels of teamwork were necessary to survive the strong enemy air opposition. This demanded, of course, considerable training and coordination of effort on the part of the crew members. We found that replacements who lacked the intimate knowledge which allowed them to fit smoothly into a bomber's established routine became not an asset but a liability. Past combat experience was insufficient to replace the teamwork built up through months of working together. The steady attrition of our personnel in combat denied our men the teamwork they considered so essential, and we were forced constantly to draw upon our administrative staffs for aerial gunners, radiomen, bombardiers, and other crew replacements. Our air staffs lost invaluable subordinates rapidly, and our commanders cursed the necessity for breaking up their headquarters teams, which had been developed over so many months. Before long, the strain of sending out men every day to their deaths began to tell even on the top headquarters staff officers. It is one thing to know that you have a mission to perform, but it is another to stay behind, at a desk, when the pride of Japanese manhood dies because you have committed them to battle. Many of our top commanders would talk to no one for long periods of time. They could not help but reproach themselves for remaining alive at the expense of our young flyers. And yet, absolutely nothing could be done to alleviate the situation. American air pressure increased steadily. Even a momentary lapse in our air defense efforts might lose us Rabaul and our nearby fields. The endless days and nights became a nightmare. The young faces became only briefly familiar, then vanished forever in the bottomless abyss created by American guns. Eventually, some of our higher staff officers came to resemble living corpses, bereft of spiritual and physical strength. The Navy would replace as quickly as it could the necessary flight personnel, but failed at any time during the war to consider the needs of its commanding officers. This was an error of tragic consequence, for no leader can properly commit his forces to battle when he does not have full command of his own mental and physical powers. Neither did the Navy ever consider the problems of our base maintenance personnel, who for months worked like slaves. From 12 to 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, these men toiled uncomplainingly. They lived under terrible conditions, rarely with proper food or medical treatment. Their sacrifices received not even the slightest recognition from the government. The Naval General Staff failed also in its evaluation of our front-line fighting men, choosing to believe that all of our combat veterans were heroes. Clearly, this was a supposition without the slightest basis in reality. Courage is something which fluctuates widely. It is determined by 1,000 large and small factors: the place and time of battle, the men with whom one serves, the caliber of enemy opposition, and so on. For the average pilot and aircrew member, the required mental outlook and physical stamina necessary for effective combat cannot last longer than a month under heavy enemy pressure. Some men, of course, do not lose any of their physical and mental stamina even when facing savage enemy air blows over a period of 2 months. These men, however, are the exception and not the rule. Should the demands of combat require that a unit be kept directly in combat for more than a month at a time, the flight personnel should be provided with rest periods at regular intervals. It is immaterial whether this rest period is longer than a single day. Even a short break has an excellent effect upon the men. Again, our Navy failed to consider such aspects of the war, and many men who finally went down before enemy guns did so only because their physical and mental exhaustion had sapped their ability as pilots. For these and other reasons, I found on my arrival at Rabaul an astonishing conviction that the war could not possibly be won, that all that we were doing at Rabaul was postponing the inevitable. Our executive personnel at Rabaul were not deluded by promises of future successes. They were experts in military aviation affairs and had personally undergone many combat engagements. As the months went by, they watched the qualitative superiority of the Zero fighter fade before the increased performance of new American fighter planes, which, by now, not only outfought, but also outnumbered the Zeros. There existed a growing feeling of helplessness before this rising tide of American might. Our men felt keenly the great difference between American industrial and military strength and the limited resources of their own country. Despite these convictions, they could only continue to send our pilots and aircrews into combat and to their deaths. Who could blame them, then, for the mental regression into spiritual apathy and defeatism? I found in my discussions with the 26th Air Flotilla flight personnel that they held the same impressions of futile combat, that further fighting could only postpone eventual defeat. The most astonishing reaction to the 2nd Carrier Division's arrival at Rabaul was that the knowledge that the flotilla could return to Truk did not engender relief. Instead, many of the flotilla's men could see only reproach in their replacement. They felt that they were being removed from the front line because their performance was unsatisfactory, that the Navy expected the 2nd Carrier Division to accomplish what they had failed to do. An attitude of this nature is dangerous, for it can lead in a short time to the spiritual disintegration of even the strongest army. As I took over my new duties as the Rabaul Air Staff Officer, I reflected that to date I had been extremely fortunate. Although I had gone through many battles, I was never forced to remain under severe mental strain for undue lengths of time. Either the campaign developed in our favour, or transfer to other duties relieved me of any excessive worry. Because of this past experience, I arrived at Rabaul in excellent physical and mental health. My own convictions as to the proper use of our air power differed from the Navy's plan of operation at Rabaul. I was not entirely in favour of throwing our remaining carrier-based air strength, which had been trained specifically for decisive sea battles, into another one of the seemingly endless campaigns fought against enemy land-based air power. This was the 12th specific occasion in which the Navy pitted our carrier aviation against enemy land-based warplanes, and it was the 6th such campaign for my own air group. Personally, I believed this use of carrier aviation to be only wasteful. It could not produce any positive results for Japan. However, these thoughts constituted my own personal convictions, not those of the Navy. Despite my own viewpoint, I could not justify allowing personalities to intrude upon my official status. My position as an officer demanded only absolute adherence to the policies of my Navy, and I would not do otherwise than to support to the fullest our efforts against the enemy. I knew that the defeatist attitude prevailing at Rabaul could only cause dissension among my own staff. I had to take every step to prevent the lethargy affecting the 26th Air Flotilla's staff from being transmitted to my own group. Until I arrived at Rabaul, we permitted the replacement staffs to work together with the groups being relieved. The overlapping duties permitted rapid familiarization with the procedures of the base. In this case, however, I preferred not to allow this contact to occur, and as soon as my unit arrived at Rabaul, I relieved the 26th Air Flotilla, permitting them to return at once to Truk. On January 25th, the 2nd Carrier Division's planes arrived at Rabaul. Rear Admiral Takagi Jojima assumed active command of his forces. The Admiral did not have long to wait before he tried the mettle of his pilots, for the very next day a powerful enemy force of approximately 200 fighters and bombers attacked the Rabaul airfield. Admiral Jojima threw into the interception every available Zero fighter, totaling 92 airplanes. The Americans exacted a heavy toll. For many of the fighter pilots, this was their first taste of combat, and they faced experienced enemy pilots who flew excellent airplanes. 10 Zeros were shot out of the sky. The exorbitant losses did not permit us merely to record the dead pilots as having crash-dived. Combat experience teaches that it is always impossible to predict the outcome of battles, no matter how extensive the planning and preparation. Unknown factors can disrupt even the most perfectly arranged operation, and it is beyond the ken of any man to predict accurately what shall comprise these factors. Despite their realization of the uncertainty which accompanies any combat operation, Admiral Jojima, and indeed the entire flight personnel of the division, had absolute faith in my ability to extricate our air groups from our precarious position. My past combat record indicated that certainly I was most likely to wrest victory from an enemy, which now not only possessed excellent and plentiful airplanes, but which exercised unusually aggressive tactics. I admit willingly that my position as the Rabaul Air Staff Officer caused me no end of personal anguish. There could be but one outcome to the war of attrition, and that would be in the favour of the Americans. The days passed in a blur. Every day we sent the Zeros up on frantic interception flights. The young and inexperienced student pilots had become battle-hardened veterans, their faces showing the sudden realization of death all about them. Not for a moment did the Americans ease their relentless pressure. Day and night the bombers came to pound Rabaul, to smash at the airfield and shipping in the harbour, while the fighters screamed low on daring strafing passes, shooting up anything they considered a worthwhile target. So intense were the enemy attacks that we literally were unable to find time to attack their bases. Our losses mounted steadily, and the list of dead and missing pilots grew visibly. Throughout this enemy effort, we exacted a heavy toll of bombers and fighters, but even our most successful interceptions failed to affect adversely the air offensive of the Americans. They threw in more and more replacements, and the ratio of enemy planes to ours widened steadily. Under such conditions, the air division could not last much longer. It was obvious that so long as we continued the battle in its present fashion, the Americans would grind us under. A change was called for, and I recommended to Admiral Jojima what was to our Air Force a startling change in tactics. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Shindo, the division's fighter group commander and the former flight officer who had won a special letter of commendation for the outstanding initial victory of the Zero fighter in China on September 13, 1940, assembled his pilots and passed on the new orders. In the future, you will no longer be required to engage enemy planes whenever they are encountered. You will attack or defend yourselves only when the battle circumstances appear particularly favourable to you. What sad words these were! How do our pilots determine what are particularly favourable circumstances? In the flashing, ever-changing situations of air combat, it is literally impossible to determine when you are in the better position to engage the enemy. The words come easily, the actions with difficulty. It is a different matter with surface vessels. There, at least, the responsibility for engaging or avoiding combat rests upon a senior naval officer. I was fully aware of the fact that my air crews could not properly judge all the varying factors of air war which would permit them wisely to attack or withdraw, but I could not arrive at a better solution. Even the issuing of the new orders had a depressing effect, for to our men such words were clearly an official admission of our inferiority to the rampaging Americans. To counter the effects of the new order, I reinstituted small night offensive raids with single-engine Kates. At no time did I believe that the night attacks would affect noticeably the enemy's northward drive, but the feeling of returning to the offensive would improve morale. The Kates attacked enemy transports in the Dampier Strait between New Britain Island and New Guinea. At times we sent Val dive bombers into the Tripoeru Air Base, just north of Buin, where they remained overnight and early the following morning bombed enemy transports at Mono Island in the Treasury Islands south of Bougainville. Less often we sent out the twin-engined Bettys to hit enemy land installations. We could not muster more than 20 planes to use in these raids, and the results, of course, were negligible. Ignoring our feeble bombing attempts, the enemy launched his newest invasion and put several thousand troops ashore on the Green Islands, north of Bougainville and 130 miles from Rabaul. Danger to our Rabaul positions mounted rapidly with the accompanying increase in enemy air offensive operations. Our air losses became appalling. No longer did anyone at Rabaul harbour any doubts as to the monumental gap between the national strength of Japan and the United States.